Okay, today we're going to be discussing positivity, the way the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe taught us to view every single Jew, every single event. The Rebbe always said, let's look at things in a positive light. In fact, the Mishnah says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was one of the great Talmudic sages and leaders. He once sent his students out into the world to discover what's like the best advice to live a fulfilling life. And one of his students, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, came back and he said, the best advice I have is Ayin Tova, a good eye. What does it mean to look at everything with a good eye? So there's a beautiful story brought. There was once a disciple from a neighboring Hasidic community. He once visited the Rebbe and he asked for a blessing. And after discussing his personal issue, the Chassid asked a question that he had heard. He said like this. He said, the Talmud at the end of Tractate Chagiga says like this. It's amazing quote. It says, Afilu poshim mele'ei mitzvot kerimon. It says, even the sinners of Israel are full of mitzvot, like a pomegranate is full with seeds. So he said, I don't understand. It doesn't make sense. If somebody is mele'im, a poshei Israel, if somebody is a sinner of Israel, how does the Talmud in Tractate Chagiga say that he's full of mitzvot, that he's full of good deeds? Doesn't make sense, right? It's a contradictory in terms. It says in the Talmud Chagiga, Afilu poshei Israel mele'im mitzvot kerimon. Even a sinner of Israel is full of mitzvot like a pomegranate. What do you mean? If he's a sinner, how's he full of mitzvot? So here's the way the Rebbe answered. First of all, the Rebbe closed his eyes and he quietly began to cry. And then he says, I have a question on the exact same passage in Talmud Chagiga. I have the exact same question, but differently. The Rebbe said, my question is, if the Jew is full of mitzvot like a pomegranate, how could the Talmud call him a sinner of Israel? You see, it's all about perspective. It's all about the way you look at an event. You can look at the same quote in the Talmud and you can look at it different ways. You can look at it and say, hey, 1 second, how is it possible that if he's a sinner, how is he doing mitzvot? Or you could say, 1 second, if he's doing mitzvot, how is he a sinner? That's the way the Rebbe taught us to view things. And, it's like this famous story of, there was once a professor who came to the Rebbe, who wrote a letter to the Rebbe, and he said, I don't understand. People, he says, are like buildings. They get very frustrated with people. Very, very frustrated. People are like buildings. Externally, this one's a lawyer, this one's a doctor, this one's that. Externally, this one's like this color building, this one's a big building, this one's a small building, this one's red, this one's black. Externally, they're different. But where do the buildings come from? The dirt. Every single person, he says, from my experience, deep down is selfish, is dirty, is disgusting. From my experience, says the professor. The Rebbe said, I understand what you're saying. The problem is you're not looking deep enough. Because if you dig deep into the ground, what will you find? Deep in the ground is where you find diamonds. And that's what the Rebbe said. Look at every event. Today America, Israel is divided. Politics divide us. Like red states, blue states, to open, not to open. The Rebbe taught us to look at every event, at every person, positively, with positive eyes, to be able to view it. Once upon a time, about 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there was a photographer who used to go around 770 at Chabad headquarters. His name was Yitzchak Freiden. His cameras, he was like the unofficial photographer in 770 in Chabad headquarters. So in 1976, he held an exhibit called 770, and he did it in Tel Aviv, in Bar Ilan University. So he did this exhibit, and it was meant to show the Tel Aviv Jews, unaffiliated Jews, that, what's the spirit of 770, what's the rich life of spirituality in 770. So there's a lot of pictures all over what's going on, the holiday, whatever's happening in 770. So the exhibit was very well received, but one journalist commented in his guest book, he said like this, with all due respect to the superb photography, the subject you have chosen is extremely clerical and takes us back to the primitive darkness of the Middle Ages. This is what he wrote in his book. So this photographer, he later told the story. He says during his next visit to the United States, he came to the Rebbe and he gave him the guest book. And the Rebbe is going through all the comments and everything, and he sees what's one negative remark. And here's what the Rebbe said in classic Rebbe style. He says, please compliment the journalist on his strength of character. And the Rebbe said it takes fortitude to differ from all the other responses. And the Rebbe then said at the end, he said, But tell him also that not everything in the Middle Ages was dark. See, that's the way the Rebbe looked at things. Always finding a positive spin, even to a negative reporter. There was once the Rebbe once founded an organization to counter missionaries. There were Christian missionaries who were trying to recruit Jews to Christianity. So the Rebbe founded anonymously an organization to help with this thing. And the person in charge of the organization was not Chabad. Anyways, he was able to gain support from a large variety of rabbis from across the political world. Chabad, not Chabad, Hasidic, not Hasidic. And one rabbi found out that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was involved, and he was very antagonistic to Chabad. He didn't like Chabad, he didn't like the Rebbe, so he removed his name. Not only that, but he founded a competing organization and tapping into the same donors. So the original rabbi who founded this organization wasn't Chabad, went to the Rebbe, and he's like, why is this guy getting involved with petty politics? And he was very frustrated, and he told the Rebbe about it. And here's what the Rebbe responded. The Rebbe said, there's a Jewish law that a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, and a king cannot serve on the panel of judges, on the Bet Din, which discuss leap years. So let me just backtrack and explain. Every year in the olden days, whether it would be a year of 12 months, or whether it would be a year of 13 months, whether there would be 2 Adars or 1 Adar, dependent on rabbis judging the case, and I'm not going to get into all the details of the rabbis who have to judge the case. But here's what the halacha says. A king and a high priest cannot judge. Why? Because they are biased. Why a king? Because a king has a vested interest in whether a year is 12 months or 13 months, because he pays his soldiers wages by the year. So that means that the treasury gains when a year has 13 months. But here's about the Kohen Gadol. Why is the Kohen Gadol biased? Why does he have a vested interest? Because he wants Yom Kippur to be earlier on in the year. He wants the year to have 12 months, not 13 months. Because if Yom Kippur is later in the year, then on Yom Kippur, he's going to have to dip 5 times in the mikveh. And remember, in those days, they didn't have proper heating situations, so the mikveh would be cold. Here's what the Rebbe said. Imagine the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, the holiest Jew. On the holiest day, on Yom Kippur, he would be biased. Why? Because he would want the year to be 12 months, so he wouldn't be cold. But the Rebbe explained that is human bias. Every single one of us is biased. We view the world in a certain sense, and we can't look at the world from a different way. We have to train ourselves, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, to look at the world, to look at the universe with a good eye, with positivity. And then the Rebbe said about this rabbi that you can't judge him, because he led a large community in yeshiva in Europe before the war, and it was totally wiped out, and now his only interest, he wants to rebuild, and you can't blame him for wanting to ensure his success of his important work and legacy at all costs. And then finally, I want to conclude with one final story, which is a classic Rebbe style again. There was once a 10-year-old boy, and the 10-year-old boy later on in life told the story himself. He says he was studying in Yeshivas Toras Chaim in Brooklyn. And shortly before his 10th birthday, his mother, his babysitter, and him went to see the Rebbe in 770. And he was a very wild boy, 10-year-old boy, wild, doesn't listen, he's not a good boy. His Rebbe's didn't see a good future for him. So his mother said to the Rebbe like this. She says, my son Sholem, he's been thrown out of every yeshiva. And his teachers say he's not listening. And the rabbis are complaining that he doesn't like the school, doesn't like the homework, the programs, he like eating and making trouble in class. I don't know what to do, I'm at my wit's end. So the mother began crying and crying and crying. And the Rebbe turned to the child, and the child's telling the story. He says, come here. He says, so the Rebbe, so the child says, I was very provocative, I was very chutzpahdik. There was a reason why my teachers had lost hope in me. And the child says to the Rebbe, so you the Rebbe? Provocatively. And the Rebbe looked at him with a big smile and he says, are you a good boy? And the 10-year-old Shalom said, no, absolutely not. He says, I was ready. I came with chutzpah. I knew who the Rebbe was. He says, the Rebbe says to him, do you like school? He says, absolutely not. He says, do you listen to your mother? No. So the Rebbe then turned to the mother with a big smile. And he says, emes. He tells the truth. Emes, it's good. And the little boy concluded the story. He said, at that point in my life, at that moment, the Rebbe brought me back to Judaism. The Rebbe made me love Yiddishkeit again, because I was a rebellious child. I was looking for a fight, and all of a sudden, all my resistance melted away the moment somebody brought in me my innocence, my truth behind the tirade, so to speak. It's like the story of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak from Berditchev. He once sees a Jew eating on Yom Kippur, and he goes over to the Jew. He says, "Do you know that today's Yom Kippur?" The Jew says, "Of course." He says, "Do you know you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur?" He says, "Of course I know. I'm eating on purpose." So Rabbi Yitzchak ben Berditchev turns to God and he says, God Almighty, the Jews, at least they don't lie. That's the beauty of the Jews. So if the lesson from today is just to learn positively, to think positive, to train ourselves all day long, just to look at the good in people. It's something the world needs today in the coronavirus era, when we have so much internal fighting, just to look at every event and every person with a positive spin.